For task 6, my article examines the effects of a smartphone-based picture activity schedule on self-checkout skills for students with autism spectrum disorder. So my study addresses two main research questions. First, researchers wanted to determine whether there was a functional relationship between the use of a smartphone-based picture activity schedule and increase in self-checkout performances for students with autism spectrum disorder. And secondly, they wanted to see if those self-checkout skills would generalize to new items and new settings after that intervention is withdrawn. So for the independent variable in this study, it's going to be the smartphone-based picture activity schedule. And that intervention was delivered through an iPhone application that guided those students in displaying the photos representing each of those 10 steps in that self-checkout process. And then the dependent variable was the percentage of independently correct steps completed by those students using that self-checkout task analysis. So this was measured, so the dependent variable was measured by counting the number of correct steps completed independently, divided by the number of those total steps, which is 10, and multiplying that by 100. So those responses, to be considered correct, they needed to happen within a time constraint of 5 seconds and in correct sequential order. So the design that was used in this study was a concurrent multiple baseline across participants design. So in this design, all 3 participants began at that baseline phase at the same time, and the intervention was introduced in a staggered sequence across those participants. So each participant remained at that baseline until the previous participant demonstrated somewhat of a stable responding during that intervention. The design also included a schedule probe, no schedule probe, and treatment extension phases. And this really allowed researchers to evaluate the responding under different conditions. So experimental control was for this study was demonstrated through the staggered introduction of that intervention across those participants. So during the baseline, all the participants, they demonstrated low levels of independent self-checkout performance. And when the intervention was introduced to that first participant, their level of responding increased, while the remaining participants continued to demonstrate a low level of responding. During their baselines. So the intervention was then introduced to a second participant, and then they had a similar response as the first participant, in which their responding increased. And the same occurred with the third participant. So the repeated pattern across the 3 participants demonstrates that the responding increased only after that intervention was introduced, and it remained low during the baseline conditions. And the replication of the pattern across those participants supports the conclusion that the independent variable was responsible for the observable changes in the behavior. So overall, the patterns that we see across those participants demonstrates a functional relationship between the participants, between the smartphone-based picture activity schedule and the improved self-checkout performance in those participants. Now, in this experimental design, they do include a maintenance and generalization phase. So the maintenance was assessed during that no schedule probe phase, and that occurred during the after the intervention was withdrawn. So during this phase, the picture activity schedule was removed, and there were no prompts provided. The students were to complete the self-checkout task independently, and this phase allowed the researchers to determine whether those participants maintained that learned skill after all of those supports were removed. Now, generalization was assessed during that treatment extension phase. And during that phase, students selected different shopping items and completed that checkout process at different supermarket settings. So the procedures were similar to that baseline condition where there were no prompts and no activity schedule on the device. So this demonstrated that those participants were able to transfer that skill that they learned during intervention to new materials and then new settings as well. And lastly, replication in this experimental design was demonstrated across participants. The intervention was introduced sequentially to participant 1, then 2, then 3. And each time the intervention was introduced, responding increased only after that intervention, and the same pattern of behavior change was observed. So the treatment pattern represents 3 replications of that treatment effect, and it increases the confidence that the changes were due to that intervention versus external variables or other factors. So that overall, this strengthens the internal validity of the study, and it supports the presence of a functional relationship between the intervention. Thank you.